Joel Goldsmith discovered something that shattered everything the church taught him about Jesus. It wasn't heresy. It wasn't blasphemy. It was the original teaching that got buried under 2,000 years of dogma and fear. What he found changed not just his spiritual practice, but the lives of thousands who dared to listen. This isn't about religion. This is about direct spiritual experience. The religious establishment didn't want you to know this. They built entire institutions on keeping you dependent, keeping you small, keeping you believing you need an intermediary between you and the divine. Joel discovered that Jesus never intended to be worshipped. He intended to show you what you're capable of becoming. The Christ isn't a person to pray to. It's a state of consciousness you can experience. Here's what they don't teach in Sunday school. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within you. Not within him, within you. He said you would do greater works than he did. Not pray harder to him. Do greater works yourself. Joel realized that every miracle Jesus performed was a demonstration of a spiritual law that you can access right now. This isn't metaphor. This is instruction. The truth Joel taught. Jesus came to reveal your divine nature, not to be the only one who has it. That changes everything about how you approach prayer, healing, and your entire spiritual life. You've been taught to beg. Joel discovered you're meant to realize what you already are. Traditional Christianity teaches separation. You're the sinner. Jesus is the Savior. God is unreachable except through approved channels. Joel discovered this creates a consciousness of lack that blocks every spiritual demonstration. You can't heal from a consciousness that believes you're separate from healing power. You can't manifest abundance while believing you're unworthy of divine grace. What Jesus actually taught was mystical union. Not someday in heaven. Right now, in this moment. The Christ consciousness isn't something Jesus possessed exclusively 2,000 years ago. It's the eternal truth of being that exists in you this very second. Joel called it recognizing your sonship, not earning it through good behavior or correct belief, recognizing what's already true. This is why your prayers haven't worked the way you hoped. You've been praying from a consciousness of need, asking an external God to change external circumstances. Joel discovered that true prayer is the recognition of what already is in spiritual reality. You don't beg for healing. You realize there's nothing in spirit that needs healing. The body reflects consciousness. When you grasp this, every gospel teaching transforms. Turn the other cheek isn't passive submission. It's refusing to accept the appearance of evil as power. Love your enemies isn't moral superiority. It's recognizing there are no enemies in spirit, only divine beings wearing masks of human personality. Here's the practice Joel taught that churches avoid. Stop praying to Jesus and start praying from the Christ consciousness. The difference is everything. Praying to Jesus keeps you in the beggar position, hoping someone with more power will intervene. Praying from Christ consciousness means recognizing you already have access to the same infinite source that Jesus accessed. Jesus never said, "Worship me." He said, "Follow me. Learn what I learned. Do what I'm doing." The moment you make Jesus into God and yourself into a worm, you've missed the entire point of his teaching. Joel discovered that every time Jesus said "I," he meant the Christ within him. And that same "I" exists in you, not your human personality. The eternal divine identity beneath it. This is practical, not theoretical. When you face illness, instead of begging Jesus to heal you, you practice Christ consciousness. You don't deny the body's appearance. You simply refuse to give it ultimate reality. You recognize that in spirit, there is no disease, no lack, no limitation. As you rest in that truth, the body begins to reflect spiritual perfection. Joel proved this worked through decades of spiritual healing. Not positive thinking, not visualization, pure recognition of what's already true in the invisible realm of spirit. The external world has no choice but to conform to consciousness, that spiritual law. The final piece Joel revealed: the cross wasn't God's punishment for humanity's sin. It was Jesus demonstrating that even death has no power over Christ consciousness. He didn't die to save you from hell. He conquered death to show you that your true identity can never be destroyed. You are not your body. You are not your circumstances. You are eternal spirit appearing as temporary human form. This understanding transforms suffering. You're not being punished. You're not being tested. You're simply experiencing the outpicturing of whatever consciousness you're holding. Change the consciousness, and the experience must change, not through willpower, through recognition of spiritual truth. Joel called it the practice of the presence of God, not a distant God you petition, the presence that is your very being. When you truly grasp that Christ consciousness is your consciousness, prayer becomes meditation. You're not talking to God. You're listening. You're not asking for things. You're receiving the awareness of what Spirit has already provided. Everything you've been seeking externally exists in the invisible realm of consciousness. Your work is to recognize it, accept it, and watch it appear. This is the truth they silenced, because it puts spiritual power back in your hands. No priests required, no rituals necessary. Just you, practicing the presence, recognizing your divine sonship, and watching your entire reality transform from the inside out. Joel spent 50 years proving it works. Now it's your turn. Margaret sat in Joel's meditation class in 1952, terminally ill with what doctors called incurable. She'd prayed every prayer the church taught her. She'd begged Jesus to intervene. She'd confessed every sin she could remember. Nothing changed. Her body continued deteriorating. Joel looked at her with deep compassion and said something that shocked her. Stop praying for healing and start recognizing wholeness. For 3 weeks, Margaret practiced what Joel taught. Every morning, instead of listing her symptoms to God, she sat in silence, recognizing that in spirit, there is no disease. She didn't deny her pain. She simply refused to give it ultimate power. She stopped seeing herself as a sick woman begging for mercy, and started recognizing herself as spiritual consciousness, temporarily experiencing a physical challenge. The shift happened gradually, not instantly. First, the fear dissolved. Then the pain lessened. Within 2 months, her doctors found no trace of the disease they'd declared incurable. Margaret didn't get healed. She recognized she'd never been separate from wholeness. The body simply reflected the change in consciousness. This wasn't miracle. This was spiritual law in operation. Joel documented dozens of cases like Margaret's over 5 decades of ministry. People with tumors, heart disease, paralysis, mental illness. Not every case showed immediate physical healing, but every person who truly grasped Christ consciousness experienced inner transformation that changed everything. Some bodies healed, some didn't. But every consciousness that awakened found peace beyond circumstances. Robert was a successful businessman who'd built his empire through aggressive competition and ruthless strategy. He attended one of Joel's lectures in Hawaii, expecting religious platitudes. Instead, Joel spoke about consciousness creating experience. Robert scoffed. 3 months later, his business collapsed overnight. Partners betrayed him. Investments failed. He lost everything. Desperate and broken, Robert returned to Joel's teachings. This time he actually listened. Joel taught him that his consciousness of struggle and competition had attracted exactly what he feared most: loss and betrayal. The external world was simply reflecting his internal state. Robert began practicing what Joel called living from grace instead of law. Every morning for 6 months, Robert sat in meditation, recognizing divine abundance as the only reality. He stopped trying to manipulate circumstances and started resting in spiritual supply. He didn't visualize money. He recognized the infinite nature of Source. He didn't scheme to rebuild his business. He let consciousness guide him to right action. The rebuilding took 2 years, not 2 weeks. But what emerged was completely different from what collapsed. Robert created a business based on cooperation instead of competition, on service instead of exploitation. He prospered beyond his previous success, but this time from a consciousness of abundance rather than fear. Joel's teaching hadn't just restored his finances, it had transformed his entire relationship with life. Elizabeth spent 40 years in traditional Christianity, faithful and devout. She attended church every Sunday, served on committees, taught Sunday school. Yet she felt spiritually empty. Her prayers seemed to bounce off the ceiling. Jesus felt distant, unreachable. She loved God but couldn't feel God's presence. Joel's teaching found her when she was ready to give up on spirituality altogether. What shocked Elizabeth most was Joel's statement that she'd been taught to worship Jesus instead of learning from Jesus. She'd made him so divine that she'd missed his actual message. You have the same access to God that I have. For months, Elizabeth struggled with this idea. Wasn't it blasphemy to claim divine sonship? Joel gently showed her dozens of gospel passages she'd read for decades but never truly seen. The transformation happened during a silent meditation retreat. Elizabeth stopped praying words and simply sat in the presence. For the first time in her life, she felt what Joel called the click. A moment of recognition beyond thought where she knew, not believed but knew, that Christ consciousness was her consciousness. Tears streamed down her face. This was what she'd been seeking for 40 years. Elizabeth didn't leave her church, but her practice changed completely. She no longer prayed to an external God. She practiced recognizing the presence within. Her relationships deepened. Her health improved. Her joy became unshakable because it no longer depended on circumstances. Joel had given her what traditional religion couldn't: direct spiritual experience. Thomas was a minister who secretly struggled with doubt. He preached salvation through Jesus, but privately wondered if any of it was real. He'd seen too many faithful people suffer, too many prayers go unanswered. When he discovered Joel's recordings, everything he thought he knew about Jesus shifted. Joel wasn't denying Jesus. He was revealing what Jesus actually taught before doctrine obscured it. The crisis came when Thomas realized he'd been teaching people to depend on external salvation instead of awakening to their divine nature. He'd kept them small and dependent when Jesus came to set them free. For 6 months, Thomas wrestled with whether to continue ministry. Joel's teaching gave him a new framework. He could serve without lying. He could honor Jesus while teaching Christ consciousness. Thomas gradually transformed his ministry. Instead of preaching sin and salvation, he taught meditation and presence. Instead of encouraging petition prayers, he guided people into recognition of what already exists in spirit. Some congregants left, uncomfortable with the shift, but others awakened to direct spiritual experience for the first time in their lives. 2 years into this new approach, Thomas watched his congregation transform. Healings occurred, relationships restored. People discovered peace they'd never found through traditional doctrine. Joel's teaching hadn't destroyed Thomas's ministry. It had fulfilled it by revealing what Jesus actually intended. Not worshipers, but awakened beings living from Christ consciousness. If these transformation stories inspire you to explore this hidden truth, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's revolutionary teaching. Subscribe for more mystical Christianity wisdom, and comment. Which story resonated most deeply with your spiritual journey? Beyond meditation, Joel taught a practice he called recognizing the nothingness of error. When you face any problem, your natural response is to fight it, fix it, or pray for its removal. Joel discovered this approach gives the problem power. Instead, you practice recognizing that in spiritual reality, the problem doesn't exist, not as denial of appearance, but as recognition of what's true in consciousness. Here's how it works practically. You face a financial crisis. Traditional religion says pray to God for money. Positive thinking says visualize abundance. Joel taught something radically different. Recognize that in spirit, there is no lack, period. You don't try to change the external circumstance. You rest in the awareness that divine supply is infinite and always available. As consciousness shifts, circumstances must reflect that shift. This practice requires spiritual maturity. You're not pretending the problem isn't there. You're refusing to give it ultimate reality. You acknowledge the appearance while recognizing that appearances are temporary and consciousness is cause. The bank account shows 0, but spiritual reality knows nothing of limitation. You hold both truths simultaneously without trying to manipulate the outer to match the inner. Joel proved this principle through decades of demonstration. Not every problem dissolved immediately, but every consciousness that genuinely rested in spiritual truth eventually saw external confirmation. The timing isn't yours to control. Your work is recognition, not manifestation. Manifestation happens automatically when consciousness aligns with spiritual reality. Joel taught another complementary practice, living in the now. Not as New Age philosophy, but as spiritual law. The only place Christ consciousness exists is this present moment. Your mind wants to live in past regrets or future anxieties. Joel discovered that every spiritual problem exists only when you leave the now. In this moment, stripped of mental commentary, where is the problem? Practice this right now. Put aside past and future completely. What's happening in this exact second? You're alive. You're conscious. You're reading these words. Is there suffering in this pure moment, or only in the thoughts about other moments? Joel taught that the practice of presence isn't escaping life, it's discovering where life actually exists, here, now, always. This transforms prayer from petition to presence. You don't ask God to fix your future. You recognize God as the only power operating in this present moment. Every gospel teaching Jesus gave was about now. The kingdom of heaven is at hand means it's available right now, not after death. Consider the lilies means stop projecting into tomorrow and see divine provision operating today. As you practice living in the now, you'll notice something remarkable. Problems lose their grip because they exist only in time. Pain might be present, but suffering about pain requires thought about past or future. Joel wasn't teaching you to ignore life. He was showing you where real life happens, in this eternal moment of Christ consciousness that never leaves the present. The third complementary practice Joel taught was recognizing oneness, not as mystical poetry, but as practical reality. Every problem you face stems from the belief in separation. You're separate from God, from supply, from health, from other people. Joel discovered that this belief in separation is the only actual sin, which means missing the mark of truth. Spiritual reality knows only oneness. When someone wrongs you, traditional religion says, forgive them. Joel taught something deeper. Recognize there's no separate person to forgive. There's only one divine consciousness appearing as many forms. The person who wronged you is Christ consciousness temporarily forgetting itself, just as you sometimes forget your divine nature. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior. It removes the emotional charge that keeps you trapped. Practice this with every relationship challenge. Instead of seeing an enemy, recognize a divine being experiencing human confusion. Instead of feeling victimized, recognize that nothing in spirit can actually be harmed. Your eternal identity is untouchable. The human personality might feel hurt, but Christ consciousness remains forever whole and complete. This oneness extends to everything you desire. You're not separate from the abundance, health, or peace you seek. They're not out there waiting to be acquired. They exist in consciousness right now. Your work isn't pursuing them. Your work is recognizing you've never been separate from them. As that recognition deepens, external experience must confirm what consciousness knows. Joel's final complementary practice was what he called living by grace. Grace isn't God's mercy toward sinners. Grace is the automatic flow of divine good that operates when you stop trying to earn, manipulate, or control. Every attempt to make something happen comes from the belief that you're separate from Source. Living by grace means recognizing that Source is already supplying everything before you ask. This practice feels terrifying to the human mind. You stop planning, stop strategizing, stop trying to force outcomes. You simply rest in spiritual truth and let consciousness guide you to right action. This isn't passivity. It's the most active spiritual practice possible because it requires constant vigilance against the mind's desire to take control and make things happen through human effort. Joel proved this principle repeatedly. He never advertised his lectures or promoted his books. He simply taught what he'd discovered, and thousands found their way to him. Divine grace supplied everything needed without manipulation or hustle. The human mind rebels against this approach, insisting you must do something. Joel discovered that spiritual consciousness is always doing everything. Your work is getting out of the way. As you practice these complementary tools alongside recognizing Christ consciousness, your entire spiritual life transforms. You're no longer a beggar approaching an external God. Your consciousness recognizing itself as the presence and power of God, right here, right now. Everything Jesus taught becomes practical instruction instead of impossible ideals. Here's the challenge nobody mentions. When you first practice Christ consciousness, your circumstances might get worse before they improve. Joel warned his students about this. You're shifting from one state of consciousness to another, and the transition can be turbulent. Old patterns resist dying. The ego fights recognition of its unreality. Problems you've been avoiding surface for healing. Sarah practiced Joel's teaching faithfully for 3 months and watched her life fall apart. Her marriage hit crisis. Her business struggled. Her health declined. She called Joel in desperation, convinced she was doing something wrong. Joel's response shocked her. Everything false in your life is being revealed so truth can replace it. Don't abandon the practice now. Go deeper into Christ consciousness. This is where most people quit. They return to traditional prayer, begging God to fix the chaos. Joel taught that this chaos is actually progress. Consciousness is cleaning house. Everything not built on spiritual truth must crumble, so what's real can emerge. The false marriage must end so the true relationship can begin. The business based on struggle must fail, so the business based on grace can form. Sarah stayed with the practice. 6 months later, she looked back and saw that everything that fell apart needed to fall apart. The marriage that ended had been dead for years. The business that failed had drained her soul. The health crisis forced her to address patterns she'd been ignoring. Joel's teaching hadn't caused the chaos. It had revealed what was already there. Another obstacle Joel's students faced was the silence of God. You practice presence. You meditate. You recognize Christ consciousness. And nothing seems to happen. No voice, no vision, no dramatic spiritual experience. Just silence. The mind interprets this as failure or God's absence. Joel taught that the silence is actually the goal, not the problem. God doesn't speak in words because God isn't a person. God is consciousness itself. The silence you fear is actually the presence you seek. When thoughts quiet, what remains is pure awareness. That awareness is Christ consciousness. You keep waiting for something dramatic to happen, missing the fact that the transformation is occurring in the silence itself. Joel compared it to a seed growing underground. Nothing appears to be happening above the surface, but massive change is occurring in the invisible realm. Your consciousness is shifting, even when you can't perceive it. The external results come later, after the internal foundation has been established. Trust the silence. Rest in the silence. The silence is where true spiritual work happens. This requires patience that modern spirituality doesn't teach. You want instant results, immediate confirmation that you're doing it right. Joel discovered that real spiritual transformation takes time, not because God is slow, but because consciousness shifts gradually as false beliefs dissolve and truth becomes established. 3 months of practice is just the beginning. Joel practiced for 50 years and said he was still learning. The third major obstacle is doubt. You practice Christ consciousness and doubt creeps in. Maybe this is all delusion. Maybe Joel was wrong. Maybe you should return to traditional religion where at least you know what you're supposed to believe. Joel faced this doubt himself in his early years. He understood the temptation to abandon spiritual practice when results don't match expectations. Here's how Joel handled doubt. He didn't fight it or deny it. He recognized that doubt arises from the human mind, not from Christ consciousness. Consciousness itself never doubts because it simply is. The doubt is another thought passing through awareness. You can observe the doubt without being controlled by it. Let the doubt be present while you continue practicing presence. Over time, Joel noticed something remarkable. The more he practiced despite doubt, the less power doubt had. Not because he conquered it through willpower, but because consciousness was establishing itself as primary reality. Doubt still appeared occasionally, but it no longer determined his actions. He continued practicing presence whether doubt was present or absent. This is spiritual maturity. You don't wait until you feel certain to practice. You practice despite uncertainty, despite doubt, despite lack of external confirmation. Joel taught that consciousness develops through use, like a muscle. The more you practice recognizing Christ consciousness regardless of how you feel, the more established that consciousness becomes. Faith isn't believing hard enough. Faith is continuing to practice when belief wavers. The final obstacle Joel addressed was the problem of persistent negative patterns. You recognize Christ consciousness. You practice presence, yet the same problems keep appearing. The same relationship patterns, the same financial struggles, the same health issues. Your mind screams that the practice isn't working. Joel taught that these persistent patterns reveal deeper consciousness that needs addressing. Every external pattern reflects internal consciousness. If the pattern persists, there's a belief operating below your awareness that keeps creating it. Joel's approach was to sit in meditation and ask consciousness to reveal the hidden belief. Not asking God for answers, but letting your own awareness show you what you can't see. The answer always comes when you're truly ready to see it. Michael struggled with poverty consciousness for years despite practicing Joel's teaching. One day in meditation, the hidden belief surfaced. He believed spiritual people should be poor to prove they're not materialistic. This belief operated unconsciously, sabotaging every financial demonstration. Once he saw it, he could recognize it as false. Spiritual consciousness knows nothing of poverty. Within months, his finances transformed. This is deep work that requires brutal honesty. You can't heal what you won't acknowledge. Joel taught that every persistent problem is an invitation to discover false beliefs you don't know you're holding. The problem isn't punishment, it's teacher. As you bring these hidden beliefs into consciousness and recognize their unreality, the patterns lose power, not through effort, but through recognition of truth. If these obstacle-transforming insights are breaking through your spiritual barriers, like to support this revolutionary teaching, subscribe for advanced Christ consciousness practices, and comment, which obstacle are you ready to transform through Joel Goldsmith's wisdom? Joel taught advanced practitioners to carry Christ consciousness into daily activity, not just meditation. This is where theory becomes practical demonstration. You're in a business meeting and tension rises. Traditional response is to react, defend, or attack. Christ consciousness response is to silently recognize that only God is present here. Not God watching the meeting, but God as the only consciousness actually operating. This takes practice. Your human personality wants to engage in the drama. Joel taught that you can function in the human world while remaining anchored in spiritual awareness. You speak when necessary, act when required, but you're not lost in the appearance of conflict. You're recognizing that beneath all human interaction, there's only one divine consciousness temporarily appearing as many personalities. Linda practiced this in her toxic workplace. Instead of quitting or fighting, she began silently recognizing Christ consciousness as the only presence. When her boss attacked her, she didn't take it personally because she recognized both of them as divine consciousness having a human experience. The external behavior didn't immediately change, but her inner peace became unshakable. Over 6 months, something remarkable happened. Either her boss softened significantly, or Linda was moved to a different department, or she was guided to a new job. Joel taught that when you hold spiritual consciousness steady, the external must eventually conform. You don't know how or when. You simply practice presence and trust that consciousness knows what needs to happen. Another advanced practice Joel taught was recognizing perfection in apparent imperfection. Someone is ill. Traditional response is to pray for healing. Joel's advanced teaching was to recognize that in spiritual consciousness, there is no illness to heal. The body's appearance doesn't determine spiritual reality. This doesn't mean ignoring medical care. It means recognizing truth while dealing with appearance. David's daughter was diagnosed with a serious condition. Every instinct said to panic, to beg God for intervention. Joel had taught David to practice presence even in crisis. David sat with his fear, acknowledged it, and then practiced recognizing his daughter's true spiritual identity as whole, complete, and perfect, not denying her symptoms, but refusing to accept them as ultimate reality. The treatment process was difficult. There were setbacks and scary moments, but David maintained spiritual consciousness throughout. He didn't make healing the goal. He made recognition of truth the practice. Whether the body healed or not, his daughter's spiritual identity remained forever perfect. This consciousness gave both of them peace that transcended circumstances. The body did heal, but that's not the point. Joel taught dozens of students whose bodies didn't heal but whose consciousness awakened to eternal life. Physical healing is wonderful when it happens. Consciousness awakening to its divine nature is the real transformation. When you practice this advanced recognition, you're no longer at the mercy of external circumstances. You've found the peace that passes understanding. Joel's most advanced teaching addressed the problem of evil. How do you practice Christ consciousness when facing genuine malice, violence, or cruelty? Traditional religion says evil is real and God will punish it. Joel taught something radically different. Evil has no power except the power you give it through belief. This isn't naive optimism. This is spiritual law. When Jesus said, "Resist not evil," he wasn't teaching passivity. He was revealing that evil is appearance without ultimate reality. The moment you resist it, you make it real in your consciousness. The moment you fight it, you empower it. Joel taught that the only way to overcome evil is to recognize its nothingness. Not that it doesn't appear to harm, but that it has no actual power in spiritual reality. This is terrifying to practice. Someone wrongs you severely. Your mind demands justice, revenge, or at minimum acknowledgement of the evil done. Joel taught that this response keeps you trapped in the consciousness that attracted the experience. The way through is recognizing that evil is simply good misunderstood, truth forgotten, love temporarily obscured by human confusion. As you practice this recognition, something extraordinary happens. Either the situation resolves in ways you couldn't have orchestrated, or you're removed from it, or you develop such inner peace that external circumstances lose their power to disturb you. Joel wasn't teaching you to accept abuse. He was showing you how to free yourself from evil's power through recognition of its unreality. The final advanced practice Joel taught was becoming a transparent consciousness. This means you're so established in Christ consciousness that you become a healing presence without doing anything. People feel peace around you. Situations resolve when you enter them, not because you're special, but because consciousness operating through you recognizes only spiritual reality. Joel reached this state after decades of practice. He would sit in a room and simply be present. People reported physical healings, emotional breakthroughs, spiritual awakenings. He wasn't doing anything to them. His consciousness was simply so clear of personal agenda that divine consciousness could operate unobstructed. This is the goal of all spiritual practice. Complete transparency to truth. You don't achieve this through effort. You achieve it through persistent recognition of what's already true. Every day, you practice presence. Every challenge, you recognize Christ consciousness. Every interaction, you see divine identity beneath human personality. Over years, not days or months, consciousness becomes so established that it operates automatically. This is what Jesus demonstrated. He wasn't born special. He achieved complete transparency to Christ consciousness through practice and recognition. Joel taught that this same achievement is available to you, not because you're better than others, but because consciousness itself is your true identity. As you practice these advanced tools, you're not becoming something new. You're recognizing what you've always been, beneath the layers of false belief. After decades of teaching, Joel reflected on what he'd learned about transformation. The process isn't linear. You don't climb a ladder from unconsciousness to enlightenment. You have moments of profound recognition followed by periods of forgetting. The practice is returning to presence each time you realize you've left it. This is the spiritual journey, not arriving, but continuously returning. Some students experienced dramatic healings and life changes within months. Others practiced for years before seeing external results. Joel discovered that timing wasn't the issue. Depth of realization was what mattered. You could practice for decades with shallow understanding and see limited change. Or you could have one moment of profound recognition that transformed everything instantly. The key wasn't how long you practiced, but how deeply you recognized truth. One student had a single meditation where Christ consciousness became absolutely real, not as concept, but as experienced reality. Her life transformed within weeks. Another student practiced diligently for 5 years and finally had the recognition during a walk in nature. Suddenly, everything Joel taught clicked into place. Joel himself said his deepest recognitions came after 40 years of practice. He thought he understood Christ consciousness early on, but each decade revealed deeper layers. He remained humble, acknowledging he was still learning, still discovering new dimensions of spiritual truth. This humility kept him open to revelation. The moment you think you've arrived, you've stopped growing. Joel's teaching about Jesus ultimately comes down to this. Jesus wasn't God's only son. He was the first to fully demonstrate what divine sonship means. He came to show you what you are, not to be the only one who is it. Every miracle he performed was meant to wake you up to your own spiritual power. Every teaching he gave was instruction for your transformation. When you practice Christ consciousness, you're not worshiping Jesus. You're following his actual instruction. He said, "Learn of me, not worship me." He said, "You are the light of the world, not I am the only light." He said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you, not within me alone." The church changed his message because awakened people don't need institutions. This understanding restores Jesus to his rightful role, spiritual teacher and way-shower, not distant deity requiring intermediaries. You have direct access to the same source he accessed. You have the same divine identity he recognized. You can demonstrate the same spiritual laws he demonstrated, not because you're special, but because consciousness itself is what you are. Joel spent his life proving this works. Thousands of students demonstrated healing, transformation, and spiritual awakening through his teaching. Not because Joel had special power, but because he accurately taught what Jesus actually meant. The truth was always there in the Gospels. It just got buried under layers of doctrine designed to keep you dependent and small. The practice doesn't end. Christ consciousness isn't a destination you reach and then coast. It's a living, breathing awareness you maintain moment by moment. Some days you feel clearly established in truth. Other days you forget completely and get lost in appearances. Joel taught that this is normal and expected. You're human, experiencing divine consciousness. The journey is eternal. What changes is your relationship with forgetting. Early on, you might forget for days or weeks before remembering to practice. As consciousness establishes, you notice forgetting sooner. Eventually, you might forget for only moments before presence returns. The goal isn't never forgetting. The goal is shortening the time between forgetting and remembering. Joel practiced until his death at age 73. Even then, he said he was still learning, still discovering new dimensions of Christ consciousness. This should encourage you. You're not trying to achieve perfection. You're practicing presence. Every moment you recognize truth, consciousness establishes more deeply. Every time you return to presence after forgetting, the return becomes easier. Your spiritual journey is unique. Your timing is your own. Your challenges are specifically designed for your awakening. Joel taught that everything in your experience is consciousness revealing itself. The pleasant and the painful, the easy and the difficult, all serve the same purpose, waking you up to what you've always been but temporarily forgot. Here's what Joel ultimately discovered after 50 years of practice and teaching. The entire spiritual journey is about recognizing what's already true. You're not becoming divine. You're recognizing divinity as your nature. You're not earning God's love. You're accepting that love is what you are. You're not acquiring Christ consciousness. You're removing the beliefs that obscure your awareness of it. This truth changes everything about how you live. Prayer becomes recognition instead of petition. Challenges become opportunities for deeper realization instead of problems to solve. Other people become mirrors showing you aspects of consciousness instead of separate individuals to judge or control. Every moment becomes sacred because every moment is consciousness experiencing itself. The relationship with Jesus transforms completely. He's no longer the distant savior you beg for help. He's the elder brother who showed you the way home. His life demonstrated what's possible when human consciousness fully recognizes its divine identity. His teaching provides the roadmap for your own awakening. His love supports you as you walk the path he walked. Joel's legacy is this. He restored Jesus' original teaching from beneath 2,000 years of religious distortion. He proved that ordinary people can experience extraordinary spiritual transformation through recognizing Christ consciousness. He demonstrated that healing, peace, and abundance flow naturally when consciousness aligns with spiritual truth. The practice works. The question is, will you practice? If your spiritual understanding of Jesus and your divine nature has been revolutionized by these Joel Goldsmith revelations, like this video to help others discover this hidden truth, subscribe for more mystical Christianity teachings that transform lives, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new consciousness and spiritual path.